I'm your host, Hillary Bricken, and this is the Cannabis Law Now podcast, where we regularly discuss issues related to the cannabis industry, including investment, day-to-day operational issues, and potential reform on the horizon that will impact all cannabis businesses and investors in the United States. Hey everybody, welcome to today's episode of the Cannabis Law Now podcast. And today, I think I may actually have my first guest out of the great state of New York here to talk about the New York cannabis scene, how it's been, where it's going, is Greg Wersching, who is the Vice President of Business Development of Housing Works in Brooklyn, New York. Greg, how are you? Welcome to the pod.
Hello, Hillary. I'm doing excellent. Thanks for having me here.
Good deal. Okay, so why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? Because I very candidly, like I said, I haven't had on a New York cannabis operator yet, let alone one like Housing Works. Give us a little bit about your background and what you're doing.
Right. Just to make it stranger, cannabis is not at all my background, but it has become my background. And I guess we'll explain that soon enough. I've been with Housing Works for close to a decade now. I started as a consulting grant writer for them back in 2013, and I came on full-time in 2016, working on the healthcare side of what they do. Housing Works is a large nonprofit organization, and we'll get into everything that they do. But I have a special projects role, and I have a communications and project management background. And when New York State rolled out their recreational cannabis program, that tapped into what I do best, which is organize the team around brand new initiative, try to give it some shape, some structure, and help get things off the ground until it's running smoothly. And I had the pleasure of writing the initial licensing application. So in a way, it's sort of like a grant, but a whole lot more.
Understood. Okay, so we've got Housing Works, and then we have Housing Works Cannabis Co. What is Housing Works? Actually, let's take a step back. What is Housing Works?
Great question. Housing Works is a 35-year-old nonprofit organization. They were born out of the AIDS crisis in New York City. It's actually a breakout of ACT UP. It was the housing committee of ACT UP, which was the group of activists that were fighting for their lives in the late 80s in how the AIDS crisis was being managed by the government and so many other folks. But it became its own social service provider. It had the initial mission of providing housing and healthcare to people who were living with HIV and also experiencing homelessness. Fast forward 35 years, we're one of New York City's largest social service providers. We serve about 20,000 individuals per year, through our health clinics. We have some 600 plus units of housing. We specialize in working with people who face all sorts of issues, mental health issues, substance use, folks who are stigmatized or marginalized because of their gender identity or sexual orientation, folks who have come out of incarceration, you name it. Incidentally, Housing Works is also a pioneer in the concept of social enterprise. So in the early 90s, Housing Works began a series of thrift shops and also opened up a bookstore cafe, which are probably the most visible piece of Housing Works. Not everybody knows about the healthcare and the case management, but a lot of New Yorkers have seen one of the 10 Housing Works thrift shops around the city. And, they see it, they know it's got something to do with HIV and other good stuff. And that's usually people's first exposure to Housing Works. And so to the social enterprise roster, we now have a cannabis dispensary.
Well, and I guess that's a nice segue. You've got Housing Works, kind of the bigger, well-known, institutionalized nonprofit social service provider, got the healthcare aspect, which is super fascinating and wonderful. What is Housing Works Cannabis Co.?
So we are the first licensed recreational cannabis dispensary in New York State. We got the first license and we opened the first dispensary, and that was just about 2 years ago at the very end of December 2022. And as I mentioned, it is a social enterprise of Housing Works, which means all the profit, all the proceeds go right back into that core agency and the mission and the services. So it's filling the gaps in the budget for all these services that we provide: outreach to homeless youth, case management, harm reduction and syringe exchange, you name it. Social services is infamously underfunded. And being able to diversify your sources of funding is just so important in the nonprofit world for stability, for security, and to make sure you can do everything that you want to do to help people.
And it sounds like Housing Works generally is no stranger to controversy and maybe getting into these areas that I think would scare the average person because they're emergent, they're volatile. Was it really hard to become the first licensed dispensary in New York under the adult use program?
Yeah, we do have a reputation for doing things a little bit risky or offbeat or even crazy sounding. And that goes back to the activist history. Just a quick aside, in the 90s, the Giuliani administration wanted to shut down Housing Works because we were protesting, and we did it through civil disobedience and other methods. And ultimately, that ended with a lawsuit that Housing Works won. But that was around the time of the thrift shops and the bookstore. And it's like, all right, we're going to do these things because we're going to, speak truth to power. But we're also going to make sure that we're not so vulnerable, right? And our CEO is one of the original four founders of Housing Works. And he's visionary in that way CEOs are, because he saw this coming long before any of us did. And I think it was in our 2018 strategic plan, he put open a cannabis dispensary in there. And we were all like, huh? What? But he knew it was coming. It took a while. There were a few false starts. The bill died in I forget the exact year, and then they had to bring it back the next year. He knew it was coming. And we were able to open because New York State was very intentional around its social equity goals for cannabis. So they reserved a large chunk of licenses to give to people who had faced disproportionate harms, especially caused by the war on drugs. A lot of licenses were reserved for people who had a cannabis conviction on their record. Some licenses were also reserved for veterans, distressed farmers, and a few other groups. A small number of licenses were also reserved for nonprofits that help some of the most vulnerable and impacted people. That's who Housing Works has been serving for 35 years. People living in poverty, experiencing marginalization, incarceration, you name it. So it was this beautiful intersection of our mission, but also the fact that we knew how to do New York City retail because we've been doing it for 3 decades. In that sense, it was pretty easy to get the license. And it also helped that we pledged to help get that dispensary open by the end of 2022, which was a thing that the governor really wanted to see because the rollout was like 2 years behind at that point. And so we got that license right before Thanksgiving, and we opened 4 weeks later, which is also crazy, but that's kind of how we operate at Housing Works.
And I'm kind of going to jump around here because you said 2 things that I want to nail on that I actually think are uniquely difficult. The first one is social equity. Social equity is always a hard conversation, especially for, ironically, legacy operators in the industry, because they think the market should control. Let it be a free-for-all. Let it be competitive. No advantage to anybody. That's one position to take. But I've always thought for social equity to work, states and cities have to do more. They can't just throw money at the issue. They need to educate people. They need to incubate. I love it that New York set aside licenses for nonprofits because I think they're the perfect vehicle to achieve the goals of social equity because they're already structured in such a way to support those missions. They understand those missions. I think you mentioned one of the Housing Work goals is to help rehabilitate incarcerated people because you can't just get out of prison or jail and know what you're doing in society. What do you think? Because now you've been through it and New York is tough because it's highly regulated. What do you think kind of the magic potion is for social equity to work? Because I'm out of California. It is not working. It's been an abject failure for a multitude of reasons. You can't really point the finger at one thing. It's a very difficult socioeconomic problem. Industries in America don't just bloom overnight. It's very rare that you get the chance to be at ground zero. So what do you think, as a VP and an employee at Housing Works, what do you think the special sauce is for a better social equity setting?
Woo, big question, Hillary. I'll be first to admit that my knowledge is informed really by the New York experience predominantly. And I think there's a lot of debate whether social equity has worked in New York or not. And a lot of ink has been spilled about New York's very bumpy rollout. I think they did something and it was intentional, but it was far from perfect. So they reserved these licenses and it was meant to provide an on ramp to people to open up their own dispensaries and get established before eventually multi-state operators and others would come in and, basically close up the opportunity. That was good. I think some of the criticisms have been that it was a slow process, just on kind of the bureaucratic slog. I believe some of the criticism was that the Office of Cannabis Management was not sufficiently staffed up and prepared to just process and move all this stuff through. A lot of criticism about lack of transparency. People didn't really know what was happening or when it was going to happen. There were also a lot of resources that were promised to the social equity licensees. The state said they were going to lease up properties all over and help build them out and hand them over to the licensees for sort of like a low interest loan situation. And that never materialized. There was initially a hedge fund that was tasked with raising millions and millions of dollars to fund that. And it just didn't happen. And it was assigned to sort of obscure New York agency that was meant to oversee it. And they didn't oversee it well. And the details are like super boring unless you're into that stuff. But that's kind of the problem, right? It gets lost. It sounds great on paper, but it gets lost in the bureaucracy and all of that stuff. And I will say that's kind of how Housing Works stepped into this even more deeply. I mean, we're getting like really ahead of ourselves now, but you have all these folks with licenses and now they don't know what to do because they were promised these low interest loans and they were promised access to retail properties, and none of that was materializing. And now everybody's looking for help. And people are getting all sorts of deals thrown at them. Anecdotally, we heard of all sorts of deals, some which sounded very predatory. One guy described it like this. He said, it's like, I got a ticket to go on a cruise in the Caribbean, except I live in New York and all I've got is a bicycle. Now I need to figure out how to get to Florida, which was a shame, though, that everybody found themselves in this situation. The other issue was that the Office of Cannabis Management wasn't disciplined and airtight in how they proceeded, and they left themselves open to vulnerabilities, and they got sued left and right very early on. One of the outcomes was a 5-month injunction that paused all progress on everybody, and that effectively killed the on ramp. That was that was the end of everybody's head start, that injunction. And some of it was that they weren't following their own regulations or they weren't following the letter of the law. So, I'm not the one to make the final decisions there about who was right and who was wrong. But there have been a lot of interesting analyses and journalists have been following it. So to kind of get myself back on track here, we started meeting these people at conferences, MJ Biz, Benzinga, whatever. And they were looking for help. And, our dispensary has been open, 6 months at this point. We're in 2023. And we started conceiving partnerships where maybe we could help some of these folks get open. And we created what's called the Housing Works CARD Community Initiative. CARD is the acronym for the social equity license in New York. And what we did was create some partnership deals where we helped the social equity licensees open and operate their own dispensaries while allowing them to maintain majority control and ownership. And I mean majority, like not just 51%, but, lion's share majority of their business. We introduced them to some investors we knew. We helped them find real estate. And significantly, we served as the guarantor of that real estate because, Jane Doe is not going to get a commercial real estate property in Manhattan without some kind of backer. We helped provide the overall project management around the build out and the design of the space. We brought in, contractors and designers and other partners we've worked with over the years on different things. And then we have, since some of these have opened, we've been supporting them with the actual operations. It's mostly back office stuff, right? We don't run the dispensary for them. It's their business to own and run. but we serve as their outsourced finance department for them doing the books and doing accounts payable. We serve as their outsourced HR department, doing the recruitment and employee hiring and firing and life cycle type, services there and running the payroll. And maybe most importantly, we train them, meaning the owners and the managers they hire and the assistant managers. Our staff train them on this is how you do successful New York City retail. This is how you deal with scheduling. This is how you deal with customer service. This is how you deal with what happens when all your staff call out on a beautiful Friday afternoon in the summertime. This is how you get delivery up and running and off the ground. So our head of purchasing, our general manager of our dispensary, our head of customer service, all these people are, in constant touch with them and help them work through these issues and kind of grow into the business that they have. And that's been this sort of unexpected second social enterprise that grew out of Housing Works Cannabis Co. We've launched 4 partners in this way since 2023. We've got 2 more on deck. One will hopefully open as soon as this month and the other as soon as next month, January. And we've got another 3 in the pipeline. And it's another nice way of helping us meet our mission and kind of, bring the unique kind of infrastructure that Housing Works has to help others. I should probably turn it back to you at this point.
Well, it's fascinating to me because, I don't get out much, but you are honestly one of the first individuals I've spoken to where it sounds like you manufactured a social equity success story, multiple success stories. And it also sounds like, and these are my words, not yours, for anybody listening, that Housing Works Cannabis Co. picked up the mantle for the state to provide resources, training, location services, outsourced financing to people that were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, whether they're a convicted felon, they live in a certain zip code, they make a certain amount of money under the poverty line. I mean, this is what this social experiment of social equity was supposed to breed. And my takeaway from this is sophisticated nonprofits like a Housing Works or a Goodwill, and there's so many in the United States, would be perfectly positioned to take on this kind of incubation over maybe an industry competitor or even government, right? And that to me is a very positive thing. And you're one of the first people I've spoken to where it hasn't been an abject disaster. And it's teaching these social equity applicants not only to do business, but be successful in business, which is a lifelong education. If I'm a convicted felon for a low-level drug crime, nonviolent offense, I probably don't have too much experience, right, with institutional investors and running businesses. So to me, the on-ramp that was killed, it sounds like you guys kind of revitalized it. Now, my second question is, and I'm sure many people are dying to know, I would also like to know the secret. How do you do New York retail? I gotta know.
How do you do New York retail? Well, that's a good question as well. And I would say this comes up sometimes in our conversations with our partners. It's not necessarily about cannabis. It's, when people are like, how do you do this? You could be selling any old widget, it could be cannabis, it could be clothing, it could be furniture, it could be handbags on Canal Street. It's just how are you dealing with retail operations, and the details are so incredibly unsexy but important. We've met a lot of people who kind of had stars in their eyes and they had big plans for marketing, and everybody wants to do events. They want to do big events at their store, and we're like, events don't make you money. Maybe they get you a little bit of exposure, but it is the unsexy work of disciplined operations, coaching your staff on how to upsell at the register, add a gummy, do how to, use software. We use Headset for some of our analytics. How do you look at that and figure out, what's the best upsell item, and then tell all your bud tenders, try to upsell on this. There's a million little things like that. It's just tweaking and fine tuning and optimizing, your back of house inventory, making sure it's kind of airtight and how you're tracking everything, all of that stuff. And then there's kind of the part where you just have to know how to deal with, when somebody crazy comes through your doors, and we're New Yorkers, so we're all crazy. So I don't know.
Because that probably never happens.
No, never, never. We tell a lot of our folks that we partner with that their general manager is what's going to make or break their dispensary. And we know that's true because the general manager is what makes or breaks every one of the Housing Works thrift shops. It's really their thing. It's their thing to be in charge of. They're the ones who are interacting with employees daily, who have to garner their respect and just, keep a tight lid on the operations. That to me, recruiting the best manager you can is the number one most important thing you can do. And, some owners are more hands-on than others. And I think the owners who are more hands-on with the daily operations face a steep learning curve because nobody's necessarily done anything like this before. And it's not a family business kind of thing in the sense that you can't just do or not do whatever you want. We've had to educate, for example, that, okay, you have an at-will employee, you can terminate them within the first 90 days, as is written in your employee manual. But you need to document this stuff because people are going to sue you for anything. And they have grounds to sue you sometimes if you're not keeping careful documentation. But documentation's so unsexy. Keeping a paper trail of your corrective actions and this and that is so clerical. I thought we were selling weed. Are we just selling weed? No, you're running a complex retail operation, and in one of the most lawsuit happy cities and states in the country. And that's the stuff you should actually be worrying about. But, people are kind of surprised when they hear that. And that's just Housing Works' take. Others might have different takes, but, what we can bring is our experience to the table.
Fair enough. And you mentioned that attitude. Well, aren't we just selling weed? Tell me, how hard or easy has it been to comply with New York State cannabis regulations? Because most of these companies, big or small, they typically have a compliance person, whether it's in-house or outsourced. How hard has it been?
I will say that the Office of Cannabis Management has been very, very supportive, in understanding that everybody's kind of learning, growing into it. We're sort of building the ship as we're flying it to some extent. And so they have their regulations and so forth, but they've been very good at, they do their site inspections. They'll give you detailed feedback on what might be out of compliance and, do X, Y, and Z and get back into compliance. They've been very understanding, which has been good for our partners. Another unique advantage for Housing Works was that we've been doing, healthcare and in particular Medicaid healthcare for decades. So, which is probably more complex when it comes to the compliance requirements than even cannabis. So we were prepared for it. That has actually not been a particularly heavy lift for us. I'll say for anybody who's getting into this without a lot of external support, I don't know where folks are picking this up from or who's helping them. It was a team effort for us at Housing Works, and we had a whole team. So, going back to your question about the social equity rollout, I don't think nearly enough resources were allocated to prepare people for running these businesses.
Yeah, I concur. And newsflash for those in the cannabis industry, if you haven't been in healthcare, you don't really know what highly regulated is because every time you turn around in healthcare, you're probably on the cusp of violating a major federal or state law. Cannabis is regulated. It's not that regulated. But if legalization were to happen or rescheduling, I don't know, it could occur. But until then, we make hay with the state-by-state license regimes. Okay, so just a couple more questions while I have you. As far as the state of the cannabis industry in New York, right? Because now you've been in it for a little bit. Is it bustling? Is it slow? Is it still emerging? What do you think?
So glad you asked that question, Hillary, because I'm not an economist, but the folks at Whitney Economics are, and they released a report earlier this year on the state of New York cannabis that has been very eye-opening. And I just happen to have a few of my favorite bullets on that. One is that it's roughly a $1 billion industry right now, and they think it could grow up to about $6 billion. So only 15% of the way there. A lot of room for growth. Similarly, New York is the fourth largest market in the U.S. but we're 15th in sales. A lot of room for growth. Here's a good one. Going back to licenses, in October, there have been about 800 licenses issued, and that's social equity and now also the beginning trickle of kind of mainstream licenses. But there's only about 200 dispensaries open. And the assumption is that New York can handle about 1,300 legal dispensaries, as much as 1,600 if there were no illegal sales whatsoever. And that probably won't happen. So again, lots of room for growth. In 2023, just a little under 5% of all cannabis sales were legal. This year, we're at about 15% of all cannabis sales are legal. All right, well, we still have 85% of illegal sales, a lot of room for growth. So yeah, room for growth is by far the big theme here. It's already getting kind of competitive in New York City. Some of that has to do with things like the 1,000-foot rule. Dispensaries cannot be less than 1,000 feet of each other, which is a good thing, to be clear, a very good thing. But it does make it hard to find real estate that is going to be, in those pockets, because real estate in Manhattan and Brooklyn is just bonkers. But in other parts of the state, upstate, the southern tier, Western New York, they seem to be opening up pretty well and kind of getting some good geographic spread. So a lot of room for growth. The one thing that was alarming in this report, maybe it's not a big shocker, but they estimated how much money, how much revenue a business needs to do to be viable. And it's, in rural areas, it's the equivalent of about $215,000 a month. In a high density urban area, $633,000 a month in revenue, which that's a steep hill to climb. Housing Works was fortunate that we had both first mover advantage and, the brand recognition, a 35-year-old brand. But that's, I guess you could call us New York famous, if not national famous. But folks who are building their brands from scratch, they've got a steep hill to climb. And I'll say that our partners, the good news for them is that every month they're doing better than the month before. So I think the starting point was lower than we hoped for all those delays and failures of the social equity program that I mentioned. But once they got there, they are improving month over month. So they're getting there. But New York's tough.
Yeah, New York's hard. These densely populated urban areas are quite difficult, especially with the illegal market. It's a very tough competitor that doesn't pay taxes, that isn't accountable for regulatory violations. It's just going to take time, is my opinion. Okay, last question. And you don't have to reveal it. You could just say yes or no, expound if you want. Any plans for Housing Works to take its show on the road nationally regarding the cannabis side of the house?
Oh, man, I think we'd like to. Like I just said, we're New York famous. That doesn't mean we have to stick to New York only. I think the next plan in our partnerships is brand licensing. Because of that experience that I just mentioned, where our partners who are building a brand from scratch have really had to fight tooth and claw just to hit viability. That got us thinking about the idea of licensing the Housing Works Cannabis co-brand so that partners right out the gate on day one could look and feel at just like Housing Works Cannabis Co., be called Housing Works Cannabis Co., so on and so forth. And so we started exploring that possibility. We have a brand licensing agreement that's compliant with the New York regulations, and we've been exploring those partnerships because that to us is a strategy for success. And the brand is strong. We've had the good fortune of becoming one of the city and the state's most recognizable dispensaries. I think people like that there's a charitable mission behind it. Could we go to Illinois? Could we go to another state in the Northeast? Maybe. But I think we have to see what's going to happen with this New York market first. Price compression is real. We saw that happen in the first year. I think we have to see how this all stabilizes before we are ready to go learn a whole other state's set of rules and regulations that look nothing like New York's. But nothing's off the table because Housing Works is a little offbeat like that. We'll consider anything.
Very good. All right, Greg, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, Greg Wersching, VP of Biz Dev at Housing Works in Brooklyn, New York. We're so fortunate to have you on the podcast. Thank you.
Thanks, Hillary. It was fun.
And that concludes today's episode of the Cannabis Law Now podcast. Until next time, stay alert, stay alive.